first speaker from the UK. He hasn't finished for 1 week it's his first week in Canada since, I don't know, 20 years, I think. And he has more than 30 years experience in Christian and Islamic ideologies as well as interfaith studies. He has been traveling from city to city across Europe mainly and other parts of the world giving lectures about Islam and Christianity, mostly to Muslim populations and the non-Muslims who would like to improve their work and surrounding situations and understanding of Muslims and Islams and their behaviors and their social lives. So I won't take much longer, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Hewer from the United Kingdom. صلوا على محمد.
Friends, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this evening. It's rather formidable to be standing behind this. It's as though I'm about to be in the witness box in a court. So you'll excuse me if I stand up here anyway. As you heard, I have spent the last 30 years of my life trying to help people to understand Islam. The vast majority of these people would be non-Muslim people, Christian people, Jewish people, people from other faiths, people from no faith at all. Now, what we're doing in Europe, which is I think something similar to what you're trying to do here, is a completely new experiment, a social experiment that we haven't tried before, and that is to build a society with such a huge diversity of religions, of cultures, of languages, of peoples. And unfortunately, we in Europe have centuries of bad experience. You know, for centuries, we dealt with religious difference by segregation. We put the Protestants over there, the Catholics over there, we put one group here and one group there, and we did not build a society in which all peoples could live together in harmony. And my view is that if we don't do that, we breed disaster for the future. Now, the first basis of harmony is that we need to understand one another. Now, understanding a faith is not just a matter of the intellect, it's also a matter of the heart, feeling your way into what must it be like to live out of this set of principles, this set of guidance, but it's also a spiritual matter. Because if I am worshipping God and you are worshipping God, then who am I to say to God that you cannot speak to me through the faith and practice of Islam, through the life and teaching of Prophet Muhammad, of the Quran and so on. So what we're dealing with here is understanding at three different levels: an intellectual level, an intuitive, heart, feeling level, but also at a spiritual level. Now, if we are to do that, then we need to get some of our basic principles worked out in terms of presenting Islam. Because normally the way in which it is presented, whether by Muslims or by secular people or by people of other faiths, is as though it was a particular religion developed by a prophet called Muhammad with a holy book called the Quran that arises out of Arabia in the 7th century, and that was the start of it and that's the end of it. And if we present it in that way, what we have done then is to totally distort the message and teaching of Islam. Because Islam never says that this is a bunch of guidance for people called Muslims. It never says that the Quran is guidance for just one community. It is rather guidance for all humankind. Never is it said that Prophet Muhammad is the only prophet sent to the earth, but always that he is the last of a chain of prophets that stretches back to Prophet Adam. Now, if that is the case, then the whole of humankind are involved together in this great project of worshipping God. Otherwise, we're going to say that God is a tribal God. God is the God of a small community of people called Muslims. Now, that is fundamentally against the teaching of Quran and teaching of Prophet Muhammad. If you look back at the history in Mecca and Medina, in the lifetime of the Prophet, one of the most fundamental things he's trying to do is to break down tribalism. Trying to break down a sense, I belong to the club, you don't belong to the club. Now, that then means that we have, in our presentation of Islam, to present it as guidance for all humankind. This then becomes a fundamental principle of the way in which I think we should present Islam. Because if this is guidance for all humankind, then it means that every human being should feel a reverberation, should feel this in some way speaks to me. Because otherwise, if it seems alien, if it seems foreign, then what it means is that maybe we're not talking about Islam at all. We're talking about some cultural form of Islam, some cultural way of Muslim life around the world. Because the message of Islam must speak to all human beings, in all societies, in all cultures, all over the world. Otherwise, God is tribalized. That's my starting point when I'm trying to help people to understand Islam. They should go home from every session feeling, in some way, this spoke to my humanity. This made some sense. Now, it may not be that I agree with everything that Islam is teaching. This is not about helping people to agree. My job is not that of a da'i. I am not here to convert people to Islam. But I am here to promote understanding. And I think that's a crucial first step in our society. Because if people do not understand what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're about, then we have no basis for building this society of the future. The next thing I want to say is that any teacher will tell you the first thing you have to do is to understand the people to whom you're speaking. You have to understand their mental framework. You have to understand their conceptual basis. You have to understand where they're coming from, as we say. Otherwise, you cannot help them to understand what you want to say. So it is as though you have to mold your key to fit their lock. So therefore, in order to help people in our society to understand Islam, we have to understand the society in which we live. We have to understand its language, we have to understand its conceptual framework, we have to understand the paradigm in which people live. For example, there are lots of people here in Canada, there are lots of people all across the West who have given up on any idea of religion at all because they think that religion is a set of rules to spoil the life and the fun of decent human beings. It's a killjoy. It's a waste of time. It's a set of fairy stories. Now, if that's where they're coming from, we need to understand that they do not have a basis to understand what is a religion, let alone what is Islam. And so we have to help them to build the necessary framework to understand what it is we're talking about. It's crucially important that we can help people to understand Islam as Muslims understand it. Because there's a great deal of history of Western people, be they Christian Western people, secular Western people, building their own image of Islam and then presenting that. So somebody saying, I'll tell you what Muslims believe, I'll tell you what Islam is about, don't go and talk to the Muslims. Now that, of course, is happening again and again in our society. That's partly what's happening through many of our media outlets. That's partly what's happening through many of our politicians. And not just here in Canada, but other countries not too far away, we can hear that happening all the time. Somebody else is projecting an image of Islam to the world in which we live. And we need to say, wait a minute, you want to know what Islam is about? Come talk to the Muslims. So I'm in that fortunate position of praying every day for my own redundancy. I look forward to the day when I don't have to do this anymore, because there will be Muslims all across the West who are equipped to do it much better than I can. But unfortunately, we haven't got there yet. A crucial principle that we have to establish in the mind of people is the finality of Quran and Prophet Muhammad, but that is the end of a chain of continuity. We're told in the Quran that God has sent guidance to every human community. No people on earth has been left without guidance. The Prophet himself is asked, how many prophets have been sent to the earth? In one hadith he tells us 124,000. How many are mentioned in the Quran by name? As you know, 25. That means 123,975 vacancies on the list. So we must not project things in such a way that we know all the prophets that have been sent to the earth. Manifestly, we don't know the vast majority of them. But what we know is that God has been at work in every human society throughout all ages from the time of Adam onwards. Therefore, we need to teach about Islam with this sense of continuity. So the principle is a very simple one. One God, one humankind, one human project, how to live like a decent human being in yourself, in your community, in your society, in your family, in the world in which Allah has created. And if that is the model, then the answer must be there is one perennial guidance. You cannot imagine that God guides one group of humankind to live the human project in one way and another group in a radically different way. There must be continuity of guidance. Therefore, we have got continuity of scriptures, of revelations, of books. We also have continuity of prophecy. So the prophets are one continuous line. They are one brotherhood of prophets. Muhammad stands as the last in that line. But he stands not without the others who are there behind him. Otherwise, again, we have tribalized Islam. It is really important that we push that one step further in terms of the two other Abrahamic faiths with whom we're sharing territory here in the West. That is with the Jewish and with the Christian communities. Because you cannot be a Jew or a Christian without acknowledging the other part of the family tree of Abraham, and that is the family of Ismail, the family of Muhammad, and therefore the family of Islam. Likewise, you cannot be a Muslim without acknowledging the other branch of the family tree, that is the family of Abraham, of Moses, and of Jesus. And we need then to break through the short-sightedness, the non-historical nature of Christian, Muslim, Jewish relationships in the world today. Many of you will know that if you went back to 1930, the great centre of southern Jewry was in Baghdad. 30% of the population of Baghdad in the early part of the 20th century was Jewish. At the end of centuries of living together. Why? Because Islam taught the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire that these people are timid, these people are Ahl Kitab, these people have rights. And so when they were driven out of southern Europe, out of Spain, out of Portugal, out of Italy, by the Christian Reconquista, these Jews and Muslims went and settled in the Muslim lands. And that was the way for centuries. What we unfortunately see in the 20th century is the aberration and not the norm. Please God, the aberration will soon be over. But we have to be able to show that history, to show that these three great faiths have lived side by side in continuity with their differences down through those centuries. Otherwise, we are going to reinforce the political stereotype in which we're living at the moment. And that could be very dangerous for world peace. One of the things about learning the audience to whom we're speaking here in the West is that if you have children who have been brought up here, you will know that from the very earliest time when they start school, they're told, think it out for yourself. Put it in your own words. Tell me what you think. Take an opinion on this question. Do you agree with that? Well, then you give your opinion. So from the very beginning, they're being taught to think, to reason, to take their own opinion. They're being taught to argue things out. They're being taught, make sense of it, ask questions. Now, some of us, I remember one of my first Muslim teachers, he came from a different thought world. And he would give a lecture. And as a good Western student, I would, of course, want to ask him questions. And his attitude was, if you question me, you're suggesting that I didn't explain it properly. So open your ears and listen carefully this time, because I'll tell you once more. And if you came back with a follow-up question, that's insolence. Now, that's not the way that our young people are brought up. If you don't question, I don't think you understand. I don't think you've understood it. You haven't grasped it. You haven't made it your own. Now, that is the reality of the world in which we live. And if we don't present Islam in a way which appeals to the reason of people, when they ask, what is it? Why do you do that? Why has it got to be like that? If we just say, well, it is, well, they'll say, well, that's nonsense. Rubbish. People are, from their very first, taught, think it out, ask for the reasons, probe it, question it, make the teacher feel awkward. That's also part of it. So we need to think again about our whole relationship with the use of reason. We're told that reason is like the internal prophet. Reason guides us to understand better and better the teaching of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. If you don't engage your reason, the Quran tells you, ponder it out. Think on these things. Keep on working with it until it makes some sense. Okay, you obey even if you don't understand. But you are a rational being. Now that's the world in which we live. And we have to present Islam in that rational way so that it makes some sense to people. Even I don't agree, but I can see your point. Now what's again crucial in our time, I'm sure it's happening here as it's happening all across Europe, we are living in this takfiri generation. When instead of saying, this is my position and Allah knows best, we have now a whole group of people who are wanting to say, this is my position and I know best. This is Islam and everything else isn't Islam. And so we're declaring other people all the time to be kafir. And this is the world in which we're living. Whereas the reality is that throughout centuries, we have had a diverse community within the Muslim Ummah. And that's the world that we have to introduce people to when we are presenting Islam in this society. Diversity is the name of the game. Otherwise, we're in danger of falling into this trap, which some people in our world are trying to do, of dividing Muslims one against the other all the time. So, one ummah with diversity, this is the way in which I think we have to present Islam. Tomorrow is, of course, 15 Sha'ban, when we're going to remember the birthday of Imam al-Mahdi, and remember this time in which we're living with this tension. And it's a tension between the hadith of the two precious things, of the Quran and the Ahlillbait, but we no longer have direct access to the living Imam. And so we're living in that tension of keeping on the track, keeping on the rails laid out by Quran and Ahlillbait, so that when Imam al-Mahdi comes, we will be found to be on the right path, and yet we're not living in 7th century Arabia. We're not living in Iraq of the 10th century. So therefore we are constantly having to move the train along the track. We're constantly having to interpret, how do we live that faith in our 21st century, here in Canada, in Montreal, in wherever we are throughout Western society. And so this use of reason is a way of taking people into understanding our Islam as we struggle to work out, how do you live an Islamic faith in this society? And this entering into the struggle is, I think, a very important part of helping people to understand Islam. It is not simple. You know, we have lots of people who are wanting to turn the Quran into a book of laws. Turn to page 472, read the answer, and there it is. Nonsense. The Quran is not like that at all. It is guidance for intelligent people. And we have to ponder and work on these things. And that seems to me to be a crucial part of the kind of Islam that we're trying to present to the world in which we live. An Islam which is struggling to come to terms, faithfulness to the Quran, faithfulness to the Prophet, to the teaching of the Ahlillbait, but also a realization that we are in a completely different situation and we are struggling to work it out in this situation. I want to make one more general point, and then I want to just highlight a few practical ways in which I think this sort of presentation becomes important. One of the questions that I get asked a lot as a Christian by Muslims is, well, the question normally goes like this. I, as a Muslim, have to accept that Jesus was a prophet of Islam. Why can't you accept that Muhammad was a prophet? Now, the obvious question is, well, first of all, let's define what we mean by prophet in this question. Because if we haven't defined the term, then the answer becomes meaningless. Now, the reality is that the way in which Islam defines the term prophet is totally different from the way in which the biblical tradition defines the term prophet. And both of them are very different from the way in which modern secular religious studies define the term prophet. So if you simply answer that question, doesn't matter which way you answer it, it's going to be nonsense, because you haven't defined the term. And that becomes a hugely important tool in our presenting of Islam in this society. Take the word revelation, tanzil. There is no equivalent to tanzil in a Christian biblical understanding of revelation. It's a totally different thing. And so if one's talking about, well, the Quran and the Bible, well, you're talking about two totally different things. One is a book sent down, tanzil, and one is a book of human authorship, compiled over centuries, multiple authors, re-editing, reworking, two totally different forms of literature. Now that doesn't stop some of our Muslim and Christian brethren who are, wanting to have TV debates, lobbing out verses from Quran and lobbing out verses from the Bible and getting nowhere. Because you've not defined your terms. You're not working in a way that we both understand what the other is talking about. I think it's really important as well that we think about some of the connotations. If you want to translate the word abd into English, well, we know the literal translation then is slave. Abdullah, the slave of Allah. If you put that into English, into this society, what you get is dehumanizing, because slavery is dehumanizing. It robs you of your human dignity. It gives you no freedom in this matter at all, because slaves by definition are not free. So by using the English word slave, you are totally mispresenting what we're talking about. So therefore, every time you want to choose a word to explain something, you need to ask, how does the audience understand this word? I never use the word slave if I'm talking about abd. Instead, I will translate it as the loving servant. The loving servant, the one who serves Allah in all things through love. You remember the famous story of the aphorism, the saying of Imam Ali? There are those people who worship God out of the fear of hell. That is the worship of slaves. There are those people who worship God out of the hope of the reward of heaven. That is the worship of merchants. And then there are those people who worship God out of pure love for God alone. That is the worship of the servants of God. That's what we're talking about. Now that's what we're trying to convey. And what I want to suggest is every term that we use, every word that we're going to translate, if you talk to a translator, if you're working from one language to another, it's not like picking out a red brick and pushing in a green one. It's not like that. You have to consider what is the message you're trying to put over here, and how do you put that message authentically into the other language? Now, we have been pretty bad at that, let's be honest. We have just taken the term that we know and we take the most obvious translation of it. And I'm afraid that we're in danger then of distorting the message. Let me take three little examples from three very common practices. You know, if you go along to any Muslim center or you go along to any mosque and you say, tell us something about Islam, well, if it's a Sunni mosque, 5 fingers will go in the air and there are 5 pillars of Islam, etc. But nearly always somebody is going to tell you about prayer. And then they'll say, oh, well, we pray 5 times a day, and this prayer is always in Arabic, and it's a set formula, and it always has this particular style. But please, sir, How many Muslims in the world understand Arabic? Well, at a very generous 25% understand Arabic, 75% don't. Yeah? Yeah. 15% of Muslims in the world are Arabic mother tongue. If you're very, very generous, another 10% have mastered the Arabic language. 3/4 don't understand Arabic. Now, if then your total discussion about prayer focuses on salah, what you're doing is presenting a Muslim understanding of prayer as people reciting things they don't understand, speaking to God in words they don't understand, by memory, in a mechanical way, and people say, oh, if that's religion, I don't want any of that. So actually we have to think this through and present it in a quite different way so that we are not distorting the message. So my example, now you don't need to take my example, but I'll tell you what I do because I've done it a few times. What I do is I begin by saying there are 3 forms of prayer in Islam. We call them salah, formal prayer, 5 times a day. Dua, informal prayer, me talking to God. Me talking to God in any language, at any time, under any circumstances, using prayers that I find in the Quran, using prayers of the pious ones of an earlier generation, the Prophet, the Imams, etc. Me just talking to God in any way. Now immediately, you've begun to change the perspective, because it's now become an interpersonal relationship between you and God, which is not a mechanistic recitation of things you don't understand. And then, of course, the 3rd form of prayer is zikr, that we should constantly remember God in all things, that we should build that degree of the remembrance of God that we live permanently in the state of ihsan. Now you can see you've got a nice 20-minute little discussion there that helps people really to get into an understanding of Islam and prayer. Whereas if we just go on about the formal salah, we actually are presenting a considerable distortion of the picture. Second example, everybody then says, well, you know, we have the month of Ramadan. We have this month in which, well, what do you do? Well, from before first light until after sunset, we don't eat or drink anything for a whole month. Crumbs, I thought you had to be mad to be a Muslim, and now you've proved it. Huh? A whole month? No eating, no drinking? If you leave the discussion there, even if you start the discussion there, or if you just leave it there without carrying on in the very next breath and explain that there's far more to this month than just starving yourself or beating yourself up. So the way that we present it then, hugely, because people will think, you can imagine. I mean, if somebody comes up to you and says, well, actually, for the whole of this month, you know, we're not eating or drinking anything from, you know, 3:30 in the morning until 9:45 at night, or whatever it is in Montreal. Hey? You know, keep a piece of furniture between me and you in case you go wild. Yeah? So we need to be seeing this then from another perspective. And how do we talk about Islam then as the month of the Quran? How do we talk about this being the most blessed of all months in which the guidance was sent down? How do we talk about this as the month, I call it the annual MOT. Now you don't have an MOT in Canada. Do you have an annual inspection of a car to make sure it's roadworthy? No? Yes? What's it called?
Car inspection?
Car inspection, right. It's the annual spiritual car inspection. It's the annual review of my life. How am I earning my living? How am I spending my money? How am I saving my money? What's my pension fund doing in my name today? Am I playing my part in this society? Do I pay my proper respects within my family, within my partner's family? And you're beginning to unpack a completely different understanding of this month of spiritual renewal. And only when you've unpacked all that can you say with any sort of honesty, we look forward to the coming of Ramadan, and we're sorry when it passes. Because if all you're doing is telling us that you've had a month of beating yourself up without eating and drinking, you've got to be crazy to be looking forward to it. So how we present it becomes massively important. One last point, and then I'd be very happy if you come back and attack me with some questions and some comments and reflections. One of the most profound ways in which we can speak about the togetherness of the Abrahamic tradition, of the bonding together of the faiths of Abraham, is that when we talk about the Hajj, we talk about it in a way which brings out the true personalities involved. I can talk about the Hajj in a class for 30, 40 minutes, and I never mention the name of Muhammad once. Because what I'm doing is that I'm telling the story of Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael, and then I'm talking about Adam and Eve, and I'm talking about the rites of the pilgrimage. I'm talking about the tawaf as Abraham and Ishmael did. I'm talking about the sa'i as Hagar did. I'm talking about the Zamzam as the deliverance, the providence. I'm talking about the willingness to sacrifice Ishmael on the part of Abraham, and so on and so on and so on. And all the time we're reinforcing this idea of continuity, the continuity of the faiths. And then, of course, we bring in the prophet who, as it were, structures the whole thing. How many stones do you throw at the Jamarat? Go and ask the prophet. How many times do you go around in Tawaf? Go and ask the prophet. So it's the prophet who structures it, but all the actions point not to him, but point instead back to the tradition and unite the whole of humankind. Just in the same way then, if we talk about the standing at Arafat as the bringing together of the beginning of the human story, Adam and his wife standing in reconciliation before God after they were thrown out of the garden, and the end of the human story, that is the day of judgment. So we have bracketed together the whole of humanity, we've bracketed together the whole human story in our teaching about a fundamental aspect of Islam. So what I want to do is to suggest that we need to give a good hard think to the way in which we are communicating, presenting, projecting, speaking about Islam in this society, and hearing it from other people's perspectives. Because I'm afraid that a lot of the time what we're doing is projecting something foreign rather than human. Foreign to the experience of the people to whom we're speaking, not foreign as in coming from another country. But we leave people thinking it's got nothing to do with me. Now, if people think that they understand Islam and it's got nothing to do with me, they don't understand Islam. They might have a little bit of knowledge about what Muslims do, but they don't understand Islam. Because if they're not feeling the pull, if they're not feeling the resonance, if they're not feeling, yeah, this makes some sense to me, it is absolutely typical at the end of every course that I'm teaching to non-Muslim people to understand Islam, that people start coming up and saying, I've learned so much about my own faith. I've learned so much about my own practice. I've learned to reflect on my own standing before God through the vehicle of trying to understand Islam. Then they're beginning to understand it. Because if we're not presenting it as a message, a guidance, a blessing for all the worlds, a blessing for all of humankind, then it's not Islam. It may be a cultural practice.
Not yet.
I'll make it hung yet. Right, now, there we are. I've done my bit. Would anybody like to come back? Comment? Question? Yes, sir. Oh, a microphone is coming.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewer, for your enlightening us with your new perspective of presenting Islam to the world. You shed light on different creative human ways. If anybody likes to ask any questions, we have a couple.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this wonderful speech and lecture. And this is a wonderful time to spend with you. I have one question. You said that you spend a lot of time trying to shrink this gap between the three religions, the Christianity, the Islam, and the Judaism. How much success do you have in your efforts?
It depends how you measure success. I teach a 20-hour course, 10 2-hour sessions, or 3 days of really hard work. And thousands of people have followed that course over recent years, over the last 15 years, let's say. The vast majority of them have been coming from Christianity, some Jews, some from other faiths. I think that we shrink that gap, first of all, on an institutional level, because you can imagine if a Muslim community, this building for example, this community, if you say, we are going to open our doors and host a course here in partnership with 3 or 4 local churches so that they bring along their people and you do that as a joint activity together, you've got a certain institutional recognition, an institutional building together. I'm asked to give a talk in the end of this month in England, and it's a whole day. The theme is, what are the consequences of saying Christians and Muslims are worshipping the same God? Because a whole lot of consequences flow from that, and that is the position of all the mainstream Christian churches. A whole lot flows from that. If I'm worshipping God and you're worshipping God, that's an institutional coming together. Secondly, perhaps the most important part, is that people meet people. So that we find that my neighbour, that I've really hardly spoken to, except perhaps to greet them when they're walking the dog, turns up to coming along to this course. And we meet, we talk, we get to know each other, and we come round for tea, and we come round for coffee, and we begin to find that as human beings, we meet together with all the same problems that every other human being has. How are your kids getting on in the school? What do you think about what's happening and so on? So the more we can meet as human beings, the more we overcome those barriers. Thirdly, we can learn from the way that other communities face similar problems. For example, I'm very frequently saying in Muslim communities in Britain, learn from the mistake that the Christians have made in not properly handing on their faith to their children. Because the reality is, as you I'm sure are aware, we've had a huge falling off in Christian life and practice, in Christian communities across the West in recent decades. Now, what went wrong? What went wrong? And so one can learn from one another's mistakes. So on all those levels, there's a lot of coming together. Of course, there are Muslims who wouldn't give me the space in the doorway. And there are Christians who wouldn't give me the space in the doorway either, let alone a Muslim. That's the reality. But there's a huge amount of goodwill there, and I think that's where we have to build the goodwill for the future.
Thank you. There is another question.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity to talk about different aspects of presentation of Islam. My question to you regarding the future. You came from a place which is Britain, and it seems to us that this is 20 years in upfront of communities, of Islamic communities, in all of their aspects, and all of their evolution, as we say. What are some of the main points that you think are important for us here in Canada to put in consideration, not to reach dead ends, or don't hit a wall, or don't fall in the big problems that the Muslim communities fell in Britain? Thank you.
One of the problems, I think that your trajectory of Muslims coming to settle in Canada has been rather different to our trajectory in many European places, because Britain called unskilled Muslim labour from its former colonies. France did the same thing. Germany called unskilled labour from Turkey. Now, many of the people that have migrated here to Canada do not come as unskilled manual labourers. And that is a big start. That's a big difference. That's one thing. So you need to analyse your own society before, as it were, taking examples from elsewhere. Some of the things that have gone wrong in Britain, well, if I take a Muslim thing first and then I'll take a society thing second. One of the problems is that it is a sociological fact. When a community migrates, they want to hang on to their culture. They want to go back to what Granny used to do in the village when we were growing up. And so you take a cultural step backwards. So it's not unusual then to find that people back home have moved on much further than they were in Granny's time. So one of the ways of hanging on to Granny's culture is that you reinforce all those little things that you learned at Grandma's knee. Most of us learnt our religion, not, I'm afraid, from the mimbar, not from the great teachers, but we learned them from our grandparents, from our families. That was the way that we were schooled in Islam. But what we were often schooled in then was the cultural Islam of the community from which our parents migrated. Now, if you try and reinforce that in a completely different culture, then a lot of young people have a wafer-thin knowledge of Islam. So they've They've rejected the culture, as it were. We don't go around dressed like we were in the Valley of Kashmir anymore. And they don't know enough about Islam to penetrate through to the depths of how do we live as a Muslim in this society. And so there was a real breakdown in passing on the real teaching of Islam. That opens the way for all sorts of lunatics to come in and divert people away from the true path. You know, we call this phenomenon Mufti Google. If you don't get the answer you want, you go ask Google. And you know the idiots who are putting stuff onto the internet and making sure that that's the first thing you find from Mufti Google. Well, if we're exposing our young people, which is what has happened in lots of places in the West, in Europe, you haven't given them real depth knowledge, therefore you expose them to all sorts of garbage that they get off the internet. Some of it is provided by pernicious people who actually want to do a great deal of harm in the name of Islam. So that's one thing. The second thing is, if we look at society's point of view, everything went along splendidly while there was plenty of work for everyone. Everybody was getting on, making a living, working hard. I know Mohammed, he works with me in the factory, we get along really good together. But then when social tensions come along, when jobs are lost, when times are hard, when things become difficult, then we suddenly find that these tensions arise. Now, if they're not addressed, if we're not helping to bridge those gaps between ordinary people, that's when gulfs open up. And what we're seeing now, I mean, you've seen the elections in France at the weekend. Okay, Marine Le Pen lost 3-1. She got 10.5 million votes. 10.5 million votes in France on an extreme right-wing nationalist ticket. That's a very serious message. And that's, you know, part of the breakdown of our society. A lot of the British decision to leave the EU had been fostered on an anti-immigrant ticket. Didn't matter whether there was truth in it or not, that was the rhetoric that you put out. What's going on in Germany today with the rise of the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland? Again, it's the same nationalist ticket. We're seeing a rise in nationalism, and indeed not so far away from Canada as well. Those things need to be worked at, otherwise we open ourselves for all sorts of problems in the future.
If the ladies have a question after Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for this nice presentation. Really, it is considered you are deeply understanding Islam. My question is regarding, you mentioned tomorrow is 15th of Sha'ban, and you know it is the birthday of Imam Mahdi. So we have a hadith from Rasul Prophet Muhammad mentioned that there are about 315 leaders from Western, just say Western. So Western meaning the Western Europe, or the Eastern, or meaning the West or East. So what do you think about these 315 leaders?
What are these 315 leaders going to do?
He said the hadith, the leaders will be 315 from Western.
The leaders of what?
Of Imam Mahdi.
Ah.
When Imam Mahdi came, so with him 13 and 15.
Okay.
315.
Okay, I've got the hadith now, thank you. The crucial thing to get into our heads again is Imam Mahdi, when he comes, is not a leader for a bunch of people called Muslims. He has a universal world mission. And again, it becomes crucial that we understand what is Islam about. It is about building justice on the earth. It is about building equality on the earth. It is about helping people to live a human, godly life. So therefore, I mean, one of the great trigger words in our society is the word Sharia. So when I'm asked about Sharia, I begin by saying, thanks be to God that there are huge swathes of Sharia in British law. It's called justice. Wherever you find justice, there is the Sharia. Justice has no labels. There's no such thing as Muslim justice or Christian justice. Justice is accessible to human reason. Wherever you find justice, there is the Sharia. Therefore, when Imam Mahdi returns, wherever he finds justice, wherever he finds true humanity, wherever he finds deep concern for other human being, there he will find the leaders of humankind who will walk with him in his great crusade to bring justice and peace upon the earth. You know, I am sure, I've only been 1 week in Canada, in Montreal. But what a huge amount of Islam you have in this society. You have people who stop with courtesy on the road to let somebody else go through. You have people who say pedestrians have right of way and not, I've got a Cadillac, move. You've got education provided free no matter how poor you are. I see ambulances running around the place picking people up. I do not think that they're saying, can you afford it, otherwise we're going to leave you in the gutter. I do not see people sleeping in the streets, very few of them, by comparison with other countries around the world. I am sure that if you call a policeman, you don't have to bribe him to come. I am sure that you can get access to the courts without knowing the right person to slip something to. That's Islam. That's justice. That's what we're trying to build, a decent society for human beings to live. Therefore, when Imam al-Mahdi comes, wherever he finds Islam, that is, a true, balanced way of life, everything in its rightful place, justice, due order, peace, harmony, wherever he finds human beings living with respect to other human beings and to the rest of creation around them, there he will say, these are my people. He will not come around looking for tribal affiliation. That's how I would understand that hadith.
Any question, ladies?
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Hewer, for the enriching lecture. I'd like to hear something about modesty, please.
Nice simple question. The way in which I approach this is to say, again, starting from the principle, the guidance of the Quran is for all humankind. Therefore, when the Quran teaches about modesty, it is teaching something that is ennobling for all human beings. So modesty cannot be the property of Muslims. Modesty is not a tribal identifier. It is about ennobling the human spirit. So what we're saying is human beings are more dignified, more ennobled in themselves by living and conducting their lives in a modest way. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is, in case you hadn't noticed, the human race has two genders, male and female. So modesty cannot possibly be a female preoccupation. It is a human preoccupation. We have plenty of evidence of that. Look at the very first verse in the Quran, which is addressed to men, as in masculine men. You are to cast down your eyes. You are to guard your modesty, and God knows best what is in your heart. Then the Quran turns to women and repeats the same phrase over again. Therefore, we distort the message of Islam if we reduce modesty to being the affair of women. It is the affair of humankind. It ennobles all human beings. Thirdly, we have this little tag often in our discourse, and we call a piece of cloth on a woman's head hijab. We've just distorted the whole meaning of the word hijab, because it is not a piece of cloth that stands between heaven and hell and cannot be crossed. That's a hijab. It is not a piece of cloth that stands between humankind and God that will be raised when we come into paradise. That's a hijab. So a hijab is a barrier or divider or partition that divides one thing from another. And so we meet the word hijab in the Quran when the Prophet draws the curtain in order to separate his quarters from the public quarters of the people. Remember the night after the marriage to Zainab bint Jassim. Okay, so what we've got then is a very different understanding of modesty. It ennobles all humankind, it's as much the province of men as it is of women, and it's about dividing life into appropriate spheres of modesty. Now, why does the first verse talk about lower your eyes? Because it's through your eyes that the heart is influenced. That's why we have advertising in the world. Yeah? Constantly, we're being assaulted. You're not a real human being if you haven't got this kind of car. You're not a real woman if you're not wearing this. You're not a real man if you're not playing that, or whatever it is. If advertising didn't work, people wouldn't spend so much money on it. So advertising is about getting into the heart of the human being through the eyes. Lower your gaze. Do not allow into your heart those things that are going to deprive you of your human dignity. Secondly, how does the heart express itself? Well, it expresses itself with the tongue. And so we have the tradition, don't we, of the hijab of the tongue. Watch your language. Watch what you're saying. Some things are appropriate to talk about in some circumstances and not in others. Not in front of the children, do we not say? Therefore, we can think about life being divided into 3 zones according to modesty. The intimate sphere, the matrimonial bedroom, the family sphere, we're all family together, and the public sphere, outside that. And different codes of dress, different codes of speech, different codes of action are appropriate in each of those 3 spheres. That's about ennobling human society, ennobling the individual and the society in which we live. If we're very honest, when we go around through society, we often see things that are more in place in the bedroom than they are on the public street. That's a breakdown in this understanding of the different zones of a human life. Now, once we've got all that established, we can start to talk about dress. And you remember that the Islamic principles of dress are again unisex, men and women both. You are not to wear see-through clothing, and you are to wear clothing that does not reveal the contours of the body. And so we're talking about modesty as a human quality that ennobles the human being. And we're talking about covering up. Why is it that in so many Muslim cultures around the world, men and women wear clothes that hang from the shoulders, down to the wrists, down to the ankles, high necklines? Because that's about human modesty. That's about ennobling the human spirit. Now, there is no such thing, I cannot say this often enough, there is no such thing as Muslim dress. Imagine a Muslim Eskimo dressing the same way as a Muslim African. One is dead at the end of the day and the other is frozen. Yeah, it's nonsense. If you go to Indonesia, they have dressed for centuries in a very Islamic way. It looks nothing like the dress of Africa or Arabia or the Indian subcontinent or Europe or anywhere else. So we need to break out of this concept that cultural dress is Islamic dress. It may be, but it's not from this culture. Therefore, we've got to be able to distinguish Islamic principles of dress. How you cut your clothes depends on the culture, the climate, the place where you live. Provided you observe the principles of not revealing the contours of the body and not wearing see-through. So I appear before you without my see-through suit on. Now in this way, you see, we're beginning to talk about this real concept of modesty and not allowing it to be hijacked to talk about 1 square metre of cloth. That's crucial. Otherwise, we misunderstand the whole business of why should somebody put on a headscarf. Very often, we're using this in ways that are not Islamic, but we have created them. Because if they're Islamic, then human beings should be able to feel, this I can understand this speaks to my sense. Most people in society actually think that modesty ennobles the human spirit, and we would like to act in a modest way, and dress in a modest way, and divide our lives into modest spheres. We need to present our teaching on Islam as guidance for all humankind. And when you've done that, then you can have the icing on the cake. And the icing on the cake is this, that we have the Prophet saying, every religious community has its own particular special character. Now, I like to remind Christians that the Prophet said the special character of Christians is tender-heartedness and compassion, because those were the hallmarks of Prophet Jesus. If only we'd learned the lesson. What is the special character then of my community? The Prophet says, the special character of my community is modesty. In other words, there is modesty which is there for all humankind to ennoble and dignify the human condition. And then there might be the icing on the cake or the cherry on top of the icing, which might be a particular Muslim addition to that tradition. And that might be, for example, a woman covering her hair. So again, we mustn't distort the picture just by focusing on the cherry, because without the cake, the cherry doesn't stand up. And it's fundamentally misunderstood. That's the way that I approach it.
I don't think I can't talk openly like that, is it?
But that's for the mic.
Again, thank you. You mentioned so many things, which is very interesting, and opened the thirst of discussing, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. Just one specific thing. You mentioned like when you do advertisement reach the heart and reflect the mind. Now, the media, if it's in Europe or elsewhere, has very big effect, and you know who's behind it, and the budget for it. Now, how, to your mind, how do we face that? Because this is like affecting Muslim to Muslims, affecting Christian to Muslims, Muslim to Christian, and all the surrounding. So just like a specific or meticulous points, if you can, just to clear up this. Thank you.
I remember well a scene in the Central Mosque in Birmingham. About 2,000 people in the mosque one Friday. And we must be talking certainly 25 years ago, perhaps more. And the chairman of the mosque stood up and said to the assembled people, I know that in this room we have tens of millions of capital. We have tens of millions of reserves. We've got people in our community who've got money. For goodness sake, can we not use some of that money to create and to train a decent press office? To present our message, to present Islam to the media, so that there are people who are trained and equipped to put the message over to people in the media. There are people who know how it works. Now, there's a certain extent that you have to play by their game, because at the end of the day, they've got the camera. But therefore, you've got to learn. Now, every political party learns. Different religious communities learn. Big business and industrial societies learn how to get their message over. Now, you don't always succeed. But I have to say, I think we are very bad at it in the Muslim community. Very bad at it. For example, there are lots of people in our society who believe that Muslim leaders worldwide have not adequately, if at all, condemned ISIL for all the wicked things they do. That is not true. That is not true. Not because I say it, and not, if I may say so, because you say it, but because we have very authoritative groups of Muslim scholars from across the different traditions who gather together and formally have declared it. Now, if you can bring out a message like that, you've got a big stick. You know, when people say, who says ISIL are not Muslims? You can say, well, read this letter to Baghdadi, signed by hundreds of leading Muslim scholars from all over the world, and you will find that it takes everything that ISIL does in 24 sections and it rubbishes it. It rubbishes it on the grounds of Quran, it rubbishes it on the grounds of Hadith, and of 1400 years of Islamic tradition. Now, you've got a big stick. The reality is, nobody knows about this letter to Baghdadi. Whose fault is that? Now, partly we've got to say we have not learned properly how to address the media to get that message across. Now, okay, I fully accept the media has its own agenda, etc., blah, blah. But look, all the political parties are in the same game. They get their message across somehow. All the different commercial enterprises are in the same game. They get their message across somehow. So we've got to learn the system. In the same way, I get lots of people say to me, well, it's clear from the way that ISIL have behaved that people of minority religious tradition have no place in Islam, they have no rights. And I say, well, that's nonsense. Well, who am I to say that? You would. You're a nice man. You know? But then I can say, but then the King of Morocco calls Muslim scholars, leading Muslim scholars from 120 different Muslim countries, and locks them in a hotel in Marrakesh until they come up with a formal declaration on the rights of minority religious communities in the Muslim majority lands. That's a big stick. You draw the Marrakesh Declaration and stick it on the table. That's different to just me giving my opinion. So we've got to learn how to play this game. We're not always going to win. It's not an even playing ground, but the consequences of not doing it are potentially the kind of propaganda disaster that we could be facing at the moment. So I really think, I have no idea what the situation is here in Canada, but if you don't have a serious press office, then there is a weakness there. Who do they turn to? Who do they go to? I mean, you know, the reality is you talk to a lot of media people and they will say, oh, if I go and ring up that mosque, they never want to talk to me. If I go to that mosque, there's nobody who can speak a decent, you know, form of English that I can put on the program. If I go to that mosque, well, they never answer the phone. Well, who do I go to? So it's a two-way thing. It's my feeling.
Nice.
Any more questions?
Hello, thank you again. I had a question regarding Amar bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar. I don't know how to say it in English. You understood me,
I
right?
do.
Good. How do we live this in a Western society, and does it apply to Western people, like our Sharia laws? Like, yeah.
The whole principle is you are not allowed to be laissez-faire in society. You're not allowed to sit back and say, this society is rotten, and you wait till next year, it'll be worse still. Which is what a lot of us actually do. So the whole Islamic principle is, you are the bearers of a message. You, Muslim community, are the bearers of the final message to humankind, therefore there are responsibilities. You, Muslim community, are the followers of the final and universal prophet sent to humankind, therefore there are special responsibilities. And those responsibilities are to promote the good within society and to oppose what is bad within society. Now, promoting the good means getting involved. Now, it may be that you can get involved on the level of being involved in politics or in local community representation, or it may be that you can get involved in terms of the kind of job that you do that actually promotes good within society. Does your job upbuild human dignity, or are you yet another exploiter of human beings? That's the question. Are you promoting good? Promoting good, remember, I like some of these little throwaway sayings of the Prophet, you know? It is an act of sadaqah to smile at somebody when you meet them on the street. Really important. You know, just to be friendly. That's promoting the good. It is an act of sadaqah to remove a stone from the pavement so that somebody else doesn't trip on it. Now, there are all sorts of little ways that we can be doing this. Wouldn't it be really nice? Do you know, there's another Shia community, mainly to be found in India and in the Yemen, called the Bora. The Bora are Ismaili Severners. What's special about them is this. The men have a special cap. White thread and gold thread. Distinctive cap. The tradition was all over India. If you were a merchant and you were travelling, and you had got some money built up in your merchant work, and you wanted to leave it with somebody, You went into the nearest town and you looked for a borrower. Because you knew that he was going to be a man of such uprightness, you would leave your money with him. And when you came back, either you would receive your money in full, or you would meet a dead borrower. So there is a sense in which promoting the good in society ought to be living an exemplary kind of life. In all the little ways, you know, living an exemplary kind of life in our work, in our social interaction and so on. Maybe it's getting involved in a professional organisation, getting involved in a trade union, getting involved in a local neighbourhood society, being involved in what's going on in politics. There are lots of petitions that go around. Maybe we should be thinking of signing some of those. Maybe we should be thinking of writing some letters to politicians. That's promoting the good. Maybe there are some goods in society, or in our shops, for example, which are made through human exploitation. I mean, there's a very good principle, you know, that if you are buying a shirt for $3, somebody wasn't paid a fair and honest wage when they made that shirt. So, opposing the evil can be in our purchasing, in our merchant, in our marketing. What we do and what we buy and so on. There is, I think, a very useful principle which says, it comes from the Prophet himself, and it says, if it is possible, put it right with your hand. In other words, get involved, do it. Take some action. Try to promote good in society in your actions. And if you can't do it with your hand, then you do it with your tongue and with your pen. So that you campaign, you write, you speak, you get involved. And you try to promote good and to oppose evil. And so if there are people being exploited in our society, that's our problem. That's not somebody else's problem, because we're human beings. That's the principle. And if you can't do any of those things, then at least don't let it take root in your own heart. But, says the Prophet, remember, that is the weakest of all forms. Because all you're doing is protecting your own heart, which is good, but it's not enough. That's how I would see it. It's, you know, we have distorted this term Sharia to make it look like we've got a code of laws that we demand to be implemented. Far from it. I mean, the Islamic legal principle is, if you live in this society, you obey the laws of this society in all things that are not against the law of God. So we need to debunk this idea that, you know, give us half a chance and we'll be cutting hands off in the market square on Fridays. That is not what Islam is about. And that is not what promoting the good and opposing the evil is about. And indeed, that's about as far as you can get from what it's about as it's possible. I always like, again, the hadith of the Prophet that says, in both Sunni and Shia books, go to any length to keep far away the hudud. There's got to be some reason that should prevent you from implementing the ultimate punishment. That's not what the media hears at all. We mention the word Sharia and that's it, sharpening axis. So indeed, I mean, is it not, in the Shia tradition, especially in the Ithna-Ashari tradition, especially, that, you know, when Imam al-Mahdi returns, he will then bring true justice, and up until then, we're in a kind of provisional state. Are we really capable of delivering true justice upon the earth without his direct guidance? Voilà.
If I may comment, if you allow me. Sorry. I think promoting the good part of it is we have to change our mindset a bit, and we participate in many of the events that happen in our surrounding, in our neighborhood. A good example is the flooding that's happening right now. That's why, I don't know if you noticed, we have some boxes for donations for non-perishable food and for monetary amounts, because we have to show the image of Islam that, or of humanity, I would say, not Islam. This is what Islam about. It's a humanity. We have to show this image, which is always far from the media, far from the understanding of general population. And I will use this to go back to Mr. Hakim's question about the media. Now, we'd like to thank you for all your efforts and giving all these marvelous lectures around the world. And it's really amazing, and there are no words enough to thank you. It's not from us only, but from humanity, because this is a great thing that all human beings need. But going back to his question, what you suggested as a first step is to try to make a press room or press competencies within the Muslim community. That's being part of the solution, as my humble opinion, because it's being done in many places, including in Montreal, for example. I have been involved in many of these activities, if we can say. But the other side of it, like, for example, you have been promoting and preaching these enriching and enlightening ideas around the globe, but have we ever seen Chris Hewer in any of the media outlets? He's not there at all.
Safa TV.
That's hopefully going to be public. So, I mean, there is another side of the thing. Do you see any, do you foresee, do you suggest to us any other path other than this media thing, which is, I mean, whatever center you make, whatever coalition you make, it's still going to represent a very small part of the Muslim population. It's not going to reflect, and the media will say, okay, this is like a new organization being there. They will not look at it as a representative of the majority. That's not going to happen in the near future, if I can forecast or predict. So other alternatives, what do you suggest? How can we bring, for example, lectures or lecturers in the caliber of yours, or this level of understanding of the humanity, to expose it to the wider population? Thank you.
It's one of the important needs for the development of cloning. You could clone me. And then you could replicate me all over the place. Maybe. Seriously, I take very strongly your words about the floods, for example. And again, it's about public gestures, you see. We had a massive flood in the southwest of England a few years ago, where they've never seen a Muslim. And what it did, it brought about a landslide and it polluted all the water supplies. And so the Muslims from a charity up in Birmingham, hundreds of miles away, said, here is our chance to show them what Islam is about. So they got all their lorries and they bought as much bottled water as they could, and they put their banners on the side, and then they drove all the way down the motorway to bring water to people who were in need, purely on the basis that they were human beings. Therefore they were promoting the good, therefore they were showing them what Islam was all about. Again, that same charity was asked by the Muslim government of Sudan before it was divided, would you come to northern Sudan to relieve the suffering of people here? And they said, yes, of course we will, that's our job. However, there's a condition. And that is, we can only come if we go at the same time, at the same measure, to the people of South Sudan, to the enemy, as it were, and relieve their suffering too. Because we are an Islamic charity, we are not a Muslim welfare organization. So Islam is not a mutual welfare trust. You're a member, I'm a member, we look after each other. No. It's about promoting human good. So I think those kind of symbolic gestures are really quite important. Now, maybe, if that flood happens periodically, maybe one of the things that you can do is that you can, get a pumping machine, collect the money, pay for it, and say, this is a Muslim contribution to the welfare of this society to come round pumping out people's houses. So you're making public gestures in this way. That's one important thing. Certainly, I think that having exhibitions, having lectures, having materials, I found it fascinating. I was asked 3 or 4 years ago to write a very simple introduction to Islam for ordinary people who don't normally read books. Very short, very simple. So I wrote it. One of the big mosques in London saw the text, liked it, and said, we would like to pay for it to be printed, and then we will hand it out to people who come to visit our centre, because they said, astaghfirullah, you explain our Islam to these people better than we can. Now again, one's got to be thinking, how do you present Islam? If somebody says, can we come on a visit to the Ahlillbait centre? You say, oh, of course you can. What are you going to put in their hands? How are you going to present Islam to them? What are you going to say? When they go home, are you going to give them a bunch of dawah leaflets, sign here? Or how are you going to do it? So there's all that is very important. Final point. You may know that in Britain and Ireland, we have had decades of terrorist activity, of freedom fighting, of rebellion against colonial rule, depends how you want to term it. For example, with the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Okay, November 1974. I was in the city of Birmingham. People, supposedly the IRA, set off 2 massive bombs in 2 underground pubs that killed a lot of people and maimed many more. Now, for about a week, there was real tension. If you were an Irish person, you kept your mouth shut in case somebody gave you a smash in the mouth because of what Irish people had done. If you were a Catholic institution, you got the police to come round and check for bombs each night and make sure that you were safe. For about a week. Because by the end of that week, ordinary people had said, wait a minute, I know the guys who live down the road, they're Irish, they're Catholic, they wouldn't agree with any of that kind of stuff. I work with these people, they wouldn't agree with that kind of stuff, and therefore, people's perception was changed by human interaction. I went to school with Irish Catholic people, they didn't. I work with, they wouldn't approve of this. They are horrified. The very night the bombs went off, all through the night and the next morning, the Catholic Archbishop of Birmingham, dressed up like what he was, as it were, recognisable, was in the rubble, talking to people, getting himself filmed, acting with compassion. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that if you are not outward going, exposing Muslim people, Islam, yourselves, in contact with others, establishing relationships that enable people to say that atrocity that has been committed clearly has nothing to do with my friends, with my community, with the Muslim people that I know. People have got to get to know us. We've got to have open interaction. I was immensely moved. I don't know if you remember the situation a few years ago. Some poor person, obviously in a state of mental crisis, went into an Amish school in America and killed a whole bunch of children. The children of the Amish community. Now, you know, the Amish are a very particular Christian community. They keep themselves largely to themselves. You know, they have a very traditional way of life. The very first thing that the Amish elders did was they went round to the house of the man who had done the act, and they said to his parents, "We don't hold you responsible for this. We know you. You've lived amongst us. We don't, you wouldn't have done this. Obviously this guy had gone crazy somehow. You must be heartbroken to think your son has done this." Now that's the sort of relationships that we need to build up in society. We need to be able to stand alongside one another and to say, you must be hurting like hell because of what has been done. I say to people, who do you think is most upset at the kind of stuff that ISIL are doing? Well, Muslims are, of course, because it's their religion that's being traduced by these people. So we've got to build that sort of fellow harmony so that we expose ourselves in human relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Doctor, for this nice presentation. Thank you for all your questions.